Rutgers football heads to Lincoln, Nebraska on Saturday for a 4 p.m. Eastern Time kickoff, airing live on FS1. Rutgers 4-0, 1-0 in Big Ten play, facing Nebraska 4-1, 1-1 in Big Ten play. Obviously, a huge opportunity for both teams. David Anderson back for a second time this week. You know we're getting into the thick of the season with you here twice in 1 week. Thank you so much for being back. This is a huge matchup and opportunity for Rutgers. Lots to discuss. But let's start with the Nebraska quarterback, Dylan Raiola, the five-star recruit, true freshman, has had a tremendous season so far, completing 70% of his passes, throwing over 1,200 yards, 9 touchdowns. What jumps out to you in terms of his profile and in terms of how the Rutgers defense may approach and attack this Nebraska offense with Raiola at quarterback?
Well, that could be an hour podcast just on that, probably. But in short, I guess the first thing that jumps out is just how much responsibility he has on their team. I said during our preseason crossover with Night Watch and the Night Report that I am not a fan of the Nebraska offensive coordinator, Satterfield. I thought their offense was terrible last year. And so what do they do this year now that they have him? They didn't change anything, really. They just call more pass plays. And so he has a lot on his shoulders. He has the authority to check at the line, things that sometimes even rookie NFL quarterbacks don't have the authority to do. He can change routes. So just the pure amount of responsibility on his plate is insane that you're giving that to a freshman. But to his credit, he has succeeded for the most part. Obviously, they've got that 4-1 record, one blemish in overtime against a ranked Illinois team. But, yeah, I mean, the first thing that jumps out at me is just how much he has to do for their offense. And I put a lot of that blame on their offensive coordinator, who basically runs the John McNulty offense from 2018, 2019. And we saw how that worked for Rutgers when they won a combined 0 conference games over 2 seasons. So if you don't have a 5-star quarterback operating the controls like that, it's not going to work. And so I have to just give Raiola credit more than anybody else. Listening to, I think there's like 6 or 7 daily Nebraska podcasts, and pretty much all of them would say Raiola is their offensive MVP, which is amazing considering he's a true freshman. I mean, that's just my high-level thoughts. Did you want me to get into like technical stuff, or do you want to make other comments first?
No, I think you kind of mentioned it in our previous podcast this week, but just kind of the difference in Raiola versus Will Rogers, who we just saw. Obviously, Raiola's been accurate, but he does tend to take more chances. I guess in terms of his style versus what you know of Schiano and Harasimiak, and maybe what you could expect for Rutgers to try to exploit that difference in him and his inexperience.
Yeah, so the first thing that the difference is that we talked about with Will Rod. Well, the first similarity that's the same is if you just play a soft zone, they'll complete every pass. Like he has the arm talent. I don't like the term arm talent because it's often overused or misconceived. My definition of what arm talent means is that if you see a guy open, that you can just flick the ball with a quick release and boom, put it right where it needs to be, regardless of wherever that guy is on the field. And Raiola definitely has that ability. So if you're playing a zone, even if you're leaving a guy 20 yards downfield with a space between him and the defender, he'll hit that guy right there. That's the main similarity. And overall, I think they're good throwers of the football. But after that, where there's a lot of different, even though their talent's quite similar, there's a lot of differences in how they play. First is against man coverage, Raiola tries a lot more back shoulder throws, and Purdue was getting called for pass interference, and people were making fun of them, both Purdue, Nebraska, as well as like third-party commentators, about how Purdue was just tackling Nebraska receivers when the ball was up there. But part of that was kind of BS because Raiola was purposely underthrowing balls and the defender just ran into a receiver who just hit the brakes. And I hate that. Because that's not football, in my opinion. However, we've also seen Rutgers never take advantage of that themselves on offense, where you can get those pass interference calls just from underthrowing a guy and having the defensive back steamroll him. So there is an opportunity to clean that up and even play better than Purdue did. The one thing that I would recommend Rutgers does, which I'm sure they will, is the technique that Bill Belichick, ironically enough, we talked a lot about him last week, he deployed in the NFL against such a technique on offense is you have a safety kind of facing a receiver, and then you have the corner or the linebacker trailing him, kind of soft trailing him. So he's not running full speed in the sense that, like, if the receiver stops, that you're going to knock him down. But he's in the area enough that you kind of have kind of 1.5 people covering all the receivers. And so that will partially offset this technique of just throwing it up there and then hoping for a flag. So Rayola kind of got away with that a lot against Purdue. But the reason you can do that is, like you mentioned, they have these big – you mentioned this like 3 or 4 podcasts, so it's not news. They have these big receivers where they can, on an underthrown ball, go up and get it, high point the ball, or make plays in a contested catch situation that even if you run this trail technique or you're in solid man-to-man coverage, like, they will fight to make plays with the ball. And so that's where I think Raiola's, again, arm talent is that he can put the ball with a lot of zip with a quick release, and they're not like dying quails. So it doesn't really give the defensive back time to really go in there and get a swat. Like, even Will Rogers last week, there was that one key play where Flip Dixon came across the middle on one of the last drives and he kind of batted it down.
Yep.
I mean, Rayola probably would put that in there with a little bit more zip even than Rogers did, and I don't know if that's going to get knocked away. So those are the type of things that he does, especially against zone defense. Like, if he reads a zone, he knows exactly where he wants to go with the ball, and rather than read post-snap where the coverage is, he's just going to fire it in there and then hope his receiver can come down with the ball. And to their receivers' credit, they've done a good job of finding those soft spots in the zone. So from a throwing standpoint, he's very impressive. I think that he does have freshman instincts that sometimes, like we saw Rutgers do against Will Rogers, you are going to be able to dictate where he goes with the ball. So if you can almost, not even trick is the wrong word, but just force him into throwing into a certain area, you might have a matchup that you want. And rather than, again, I don't trust Nebraska's offensive coordinator to take advantage of their personnel. So it doesn't really matter who's in what position running what route. Like, he's going to throw it to that guy, even if it's a bad matchup, even if it's a shorter receiver going against Flip Dixon in a contested situation, or it's a smaller, faster receiver going against a faster corner like Longer Beam. He doesn't seem to take that into account. He's got the skills to try to beat the defense with this throw, in effect.
Yeah, I think that aspect of his game is really interesting in this matchup defensively with Rutgers, because I feel like Harasimiak and Chiano, just in terms of, seeing more disguised looks, will we see more blitzes in this game to bring extra pressure? But how concerned are you with talking about the big receivers, Jamal Banks and Isaiah Nayor, in terms of their physicality, their size, matching up with that Rutgers secondary? I guess, what do you feel like that matchup looks like on paper, and maybe how does Rutgers counter that they are, such big and physical receivers?
Well, I think this kind of comes to a point we talked about 2 weeks ago with Virginia Tech. This is where coaching really needs to know what their players can and can't do. Mm-hmm. So is Desmond Igbinosun fast enough to cover one of these guys if they're running downfield? If yes, that opens up a lot of possibilities. I think Shaquan Loyal can, and I think he's big enough at this point in his career, probably not when he was a freshman, but now that he can kind of battle with these guys. So you may be able to get away with not forcing your cornerbacks to kind of, beat up these guys on every play. I mean, Eric Rogers and Robert Longerbeam are good cornerbacks. Again, we're not even 100% sure on their health. I think they both got injured in that game and came back. So, and Shano's obviously coy during his press conference talking about it. But what happens against cornerbacks like this is if they're going to have to jam at the line, I mean, Nebraska is going to be the aggressor at wide receiver. Like, normally the corner is the one who's trying to jam at the line. Nebraska is probably going to be the team that's trying to get a body on the Rutgers cornerbacks to get physical and wear them down, because a smaller corner can hold up on a play-to-play basis. But if you deliver them enough body blows, it starts to impact them as the game goes on. I mean, think about anyone over the age of 30, like you have a shoulder injury and somehow it affects your rest of your body. Like it over time that kind of happens. So I do think Rodgers and Longerbeam, they might be able to get through this week, even if they have to play a lot of snaps, but they'll feel it the next day. So I think that there's a shot that it could take a physical toll on them. I mean, one thing going in Rutgers' favor is Nebraska's receivers don't always want to block. And if they are more committed to run blocking, then I do think they'll even wear the Rutgers DBs out more. So I do think Rutgers is going to have to protect Longerbeam from having to like basically fight physically on every down with the guy. That's not what he does best. And then in terms of bringing pressure, you can bring. I do expect Rutgers will bring some corner blitzes, especially because, like I said, if the safeties can hold up against these taller receivers who aren't nearly as fast as the receivers we saw the last 2 weeks, then you may be able to make some more exotic calls that will force Rayola into making plays. And the one thing I'll say about him is, like any quarterback, you can pressure him. If you pressure him, he doesn't take that many sacks. Sometimes he holds the ball a little bit too long, but to his credit, he finds his hot read. But a lot of times he'll throw it to his hot receiver, and either the guy runs a bad route or he's very covered and then gets tackled right away. So like on a 3rd and 10, if you can bring pressure, he'll check it down. Well, he'll either throw in his jump balls, like I said, to a receiver and hope for a PI, or he'll throw like a check down to a running back over the middle that may only be 4 yards past the line of scrimmage, and there's a defender draped all over him, and he won't be able to get the first down. And Purdue did a good job with that, of kind of dictating a hot route, and that's where, he is a little bit inexperienced, doesn't always know what distance he needs to get for the first down type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really good point. The pacing this game, Nebraska throws basically 2/3 of the time. It's going to be interesting to see how Rutgers can handle that. Shannon talked about rotating more players in this game, specifically at cornerback. Bo Mascow is certainly going to be a factor. Longerbeam, as you mentioned, not as physical as a cornerback, but what will be really interesting in terms of this game is the matchup with the defense, the Rutgers defense, Nebraska offense. Is that special teams have been a disaster for Nebraska. It's going to just go for it anytime they're near midfield or in Rutgers side of the field. I guess, how does that impact kind of the game plan from a defensive standpoint, knowing that you're playing a team that probably isn't even, as you mentioned offline, like punting is an issue, kicking field goals is an issue. Does that kind of change the mindset or the game plan at all?
Like I was saying in my earlier point, where on a 3rd and 10, if you blitz and Nebraska completes a check down for, let's say, 5 yards, you got to be expecting that they're going to go for it on 4th and 5 if they're in past the 50-yard line. So I don't think that necessarily changes your strategy, because you always want to force a team into a 4th down situation for sure. So I don't think you should not blitz, because if you're not aggressive, I mean, this is a classic team where if you don't put pressure on him, he'll complete it for not just 10, he'll complete it for 25 yards, much like we saw with Washington last week. You cannot give him a lot of time. So ultimately, the Rutgers defense has given up a lot of yards, but they have been stout on 3rd down. And so this kind of leads me back to kind of circle back to a point that I was making on an earlier podcast this week with you, was when you asked me what my confidence level was in the Rutgers defense. I was thinking about it more as like a team. What's my confidence level about that they are a defense of an 8-4, a 9-3 team, maybe not that they're going to go 12-0. Do I think this defense can good enough to go 12-0? No. Are they good enough to win in any given week by shutting down a team in clutch situations? Yes. And so that's where kind of the old North Carolina State, Jim Valvano, survive and advance type of thing. I mean, Rutgers needs to legitimately take this week by week. I know people hate the 1-0 thing, but they cannot be focused on anything but Nebraska. And if they are, then, things like this 3rd down conversion, 3rd down defense, they've done a good job so far. They got to keep that up. If they want to defeat a team like Nebraska and, keep the ball rolling. I think the key thing, though, from the Nebraska offensive standpoint is, can they run the ball? And Rutgers' run defense has been not great, but I can tell you that Nebraska's offense, the reason they don't run the ball, first of all, is because I don't think they have a very good run scheme, because, again, I'm very critical of their offensive coordinator. But I think their offensive linemen actually are run blocking fairly well. When I look at they say they're better in pass blocking than run blocking. when I see their run blocking, they seem to be doing their assignments. But if you look at that game against Purdue, first play of the game, they have a perfect, like almost stretch play called to the left. The running back, who I think it was Dowdell on that particular play, but it doesn't matter because most of the running backs have the same problem. He cuts it back into like two defenders when Nebraska has the numbers advantage out to the left side, and he decides to just cut it back inside for no reason. I really have no idea what he was doing. And so later in the game, there was a similar situation they were in. It was like 3rd down and 5, and they ran it was kind of like, I don't know if it was a toss or a stretch play to the right, but it was the same exact thing, different running back. Linemen have it blocked perfectly. Linemen are pulling, I think it was a guard, 2 guards maybe, or maybe it was the left tackle and the right guard. They're pulling. Dude's got a wide open lane, and he runs straight into like a guy who is being blocked by a Nebraska wide receiver. And I was like, if that was Kyle Monungai, it would have been a 30-yard gain. Mm-hmm. And if Kyle Monungai was on this Nebraska team, he would have like 650, 750 yards already because their passing game is there. Their running backs just have very poor vision, and I'm knocking on wood because you don't want them to discover this all of a sudden against Rutgers. But what I see from their running backs overall is they use 4 or 5. The only one that I really think is decent in this area is Ramir Johnson. I mean, Emmett Johnson, Dowdell, Irvin, I think, had a few carries. He's more of like the goal line back. And then there's one other one that was playing. Like between all of them, I think only one has even average vision. And so that makes them shy away from calling these run plays because even a perfectly called play, perfectly blocked, it has occasionally resulted in 0 or even, loss of yardage for no reason. And so, again, I think their offensive line has played better than we thought, even though when you look at their spring offensive line starters, only 2 of those guys are in the position that they're in now. They've had this bizarre situation with one of their guards being like suspended but hurt, like all kinds of weird stuff. But the guys who have played have done pretty well. Nebraska, it'll be interesting to see if Nebraska puts more trust in their running game, considering they're going to go for it on 4th, to maybe run on 3rd and 8 for a few yards if Rutgers is playing it a little bit soft. So I don't think Rutgers can just sell out for the run in that situation or even play too much of a shell defensively. Like they're going to have to find some balance like they did last week about pressure and then also just staying disciplined against the run because sometimes these running backs are going to run right into your arms as a defensive lineman or a linebacker.
Yeah, that makes sense. A lot of great points there. It's a good segue to shift now to the opposite side of the ball. The Rutgers, the Nebraska run defense, ranks really high right now. But the flip side of that is they really haven't faced a good running team yet. Purdue's the highest ranked running team they faced, 79th. Rutgers, obviously 15th nationally in rushing offense. Two-headed monster of Kyle Monungai and Sam Brown. How much do you think this, obviously the front 4 of Nebraska has been pretty stout. I mean, they're very disruptive overall. They have 16 sacks, over 30 tackles for loss. They can create havoc up front with pressure. But what do you kind of think in terms of how Rutgers matches up in the run game? Can Rutgers be effective in the run game? Are they going to look to establish the run game, or is this maybe a game where they look to establish the pass first to be able to get that run game going and open up things down as the game goes on?
Well, I think this is probably a good point to mention that weather is going to be a factor. It's going to be super hot. And then, it's going to be super hot, but then I think you were mentioning to me by late in the game, temperatures might drop significantly, it's
the weirdest weather forecast I can remember for a game. So it's a high of 94. This game tips off at 3 p.m., but by nighttime, which, 7 o'clock is nighttime, it's supposed to be in the 50s. So, but the wind is over 20 miles per hour throughout. So how is that going to affect Rayola with his, when he airs it out? How is it going to impact the Rucker strategy? But yeah, to your point, the heat, does that motivate or not motivate, but does that incentivize Rutgers to maybe really, because one thing I think is interesting is that in these last 2 wins, Rutgers didn't win the game traditionally the way they did last year in terms of, you've talked about those body blows throughout the game and then wearing teams down the stretch. Perhaps this is a game that you will see them intentionally try to do that with the game plan.
I think that is the right approach, yes. And it sounds kind of boring and simplistic, but when you look at Nebraska, one of the things they do that's similar to Washington up front is they kind of have a third down package on their defensive line. And so if they get into third and long, they can get fresh legs in there to try to generate some pass rush. And then it also gives the guys in the middle an opportunity, or even the defensive. There's some defensive ends that are more in there for rundowns than they come out for pass downs. They don't always rotate their D tackles, but you got to wear down particularly two guys, particularly that one lineman. I think it's Ty Robinson, number 9. He's a huge dude, 6'6", 310. He had a lot of tackles for loss earlier in the year, and you got to try to put some body blows on their defensive line. And there's 2 reasons for that primarily. Obviously, there's many why you would have that as your strategy. But the 2 main that I'm looking at that make this game unique is that if you can get Nebraska to have a lack of pass rush, they run a lot of more basic coverages in the secondary on purpose, because so far they haven't had a lot of tests, against good offenses. And so one of the things that you can do is, if you can wear down their defensive front, it forces their middle linebacker, or I'm not sure if he always plays middle because he's kind of roves everywhere. Bullock, he's a really good player, great player. And to his credit, the Matt Rule staff took this guy from being like a rotational at best safety to like one of the best linebackers in the Big Ten. He kind of roves everywhere. So if you can force him to have to stay in the box and make tackles, that limits what they do in coverage, because sometimes they'll run like a Tampa 2 where he drops all the way back. But if he's forced to stay closer to the line to defend against the run because the D-line isn't making a lot of those tackles, that really limits what they can do defensively. So I think you have to attack him particularly, make him make decisions, put him in conflict. The term that you often hear used around, like he has to be a defender against the run and the pass. Maybe there's different guys he might have to defend in the pass game. And so I'm looking at a run scheme that's going to go right after that. Also on their defensive line, they get some pressure, but a lot of that comes from either fresh guys on third downs, or they do like to do a lot of twisting or a lot of like stunting with their ends, because their defensive ends are pretty big for defensive ends. So they can kind of hold up in the middle. But there's a lot of opportunities to trap them or even run counters where if they're crossing up, you have a good leverage point and a space opening up for a big run to take place. And so they really trust, especially Bullock, that if they're doing that, right, and taking the time to run a stunt and there's a hole there, well, this guy's going here before this guy can come across, running right here, they're relying on their middle linebackers to make tackles in space. And so there's going to be a lot of those mano-a-mano, middle of the field type plays for Sam Brown and Kyle Monangai. And I think that's the right strategy, because so far they haven't had to tackle someone like him yet this season.
Yeah, great points there. It is going to be fascinating to see. One thing that Justin, Nebraska site, mentioned was with Illinois, a key to them beating Nebraska was that they were able to stick to their game plan the whole time, and that they established control early in that game. And as we know, Rutgers was successful against Virginia Tech and Washington by jumping out to 2-score leads in the first half. What I'm curious about is this first quarter, right? Because it's almost like, are these two teams going to kind of bob and weave a little bit and try to feel each other out? Or is someone going to go for a big hit early to try to establish that lead? Because it's obviously cliche, but whoever establishes that lead first is going to have the advantage. But from a Rutgers standpoint, they're built to play with a lead, and their game plan and how Shiano wants to call the game. And whoever makes that first critical mistake is certainly going to be at a disadvantage. And we've seen Rutgers successfully take advantage of early mistakes from Virginia Tech and Washington. So I just find that going to be interesting, especially with Rayola and just kind of how the Nebraska offense shoots from the hip a little bit. This feels like a game where the Rutgers defense needs to create turnovers. And because I don't know, even though I think you're right, Rutgers can basically establish control and grind down Nebraska in the run game. I don't think you can count on them either to have, put together 4 to 5, 70, 80-yard sustained drives. They're going to need some type of break, either big play on defense or special teams to get a short field to be able to get a quick score, I think, at some point in this game. Thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, what scares you about Nebraska is that they don't need to call like deep shot bombs to get big plays. I
Yeah.
mean, their quarterback is good enough that they just run their regular plays all 4 quarters, and that's it. Like, and they still might get some big plays out of it without risk of a lot of turnovers. When a quarterback has this arm ability and accuracy, there's not nearly as many opportunities, for example, to get tip balls and things like that. Whereas when you're playing a lesser quarterback, you can get a lot of turnovers sometimes just by, battling in. Like, think about the Michigan State game last year. Rutgers was just getting tip balls, and they didn't even pick off as many as they could have in that game, partially because it was wet conditions. But Rayola doesn't throw balls that are easily picked off or even tipped. And so a lot of that kind of goes out the window there. I mean, I think the turnovers are going to have to come from just fighting hard and getting a fumble or a sack or, a running back trying to make a move and being too cute type of thing. Whereas on the Rutgers side, I mean, what concerns me against the Nebraska defense is the Nebraska defense, they can sometimes run that Tampa 2. They did that last week a lot, and they were not always effective. But what they were doing against Illinois is their more standard kind of like quarters defense, where the cornerbacks are dropping way back. You got safeties back, and then they rely on the linebackers and whoever kind of that rover is, whatever. I don't know what they call it, but it's basically the third safety, like to kind of cover a lot in the middle of the field. And they'll give you receiver passes for 5 yards if everybody's dropping back. They'll give that to you. But Rutgers' biggest weakness on offense is that Ethancik Manis throwing outside the numbers is probably the scariest thing that happens when Rutgers' offense has the ball. And so it's not necessarily a good fit in that Nebraska's weakness defensively is also Rutgers' weakness offensively. And so how do you compensate for that? Either you got to do what they did with Virginia Tech, which was get Kenny Fletcher moving across. And so he catches the ball in the middle, but then he gets outside the numbers. That's one way to do it. Or you can get some kind of slant routes where if they have to respect, for example, Demir Miller's deep speed, he can run kind of like a slant or like a intermediate crossing route. And if you get him the ball on time, then that also can take advantage of cornerbacks not pressing. Now, what they did last week was the reverse. The cornerbacks were pressing against Purdue, and they were relying on the linebacker and the 2 safeties deep. And so a lot depends on which attack the Nebraska defense, which approach they take. But regardless, I think you're going to want to run the ball heavy early to try to figure out what coverages they're in. Because even if you don't pass the ball, you might be able to tell what coverages they're in and start figuring out what their tells are defensively. And a coach like Kirk Shiraka is going to pick up on stuff like that frequently, right? So I think that's going to be what Rutgers tries to do. But, yeah, I mean, this one might just get ugly, grinded out in the middle type of thing. And Nebraska is not the same level of front that they've had historically speaking. So I think this might be one of the few times I'll ever say that you might be able to wear down their defensive front. Very rarely in the past, even when they've had bad teams under Scott Frost, were you able to just run it up the gut and beat them. But this might be the time you have to try and just kind of wear them down and then figure out what pass plays are going to work based on their coverages.
The interesting angle in this is that Ethancik Manis is 2-0 career-wise against Nebraska when he was at Minnesota, won at Nebraska 2 years ago, really managed the game in that one, just 6 of 12, modest yardage, where last year in the season opener at Minnesota, he threw the ball over 40 times, did have a touchdown and interception, about 200 yards throwing. He obviously is going to have confidence in this in terms of playing Nebraska. But I do, to your point, I feel like this is a game where he's going to have some type of big pass play at some point, whether it's, a deep ball or, like you mentioned, maybe a slant to Miller that goes, for a lot of yards where for Rutgers to deliver those body blows down the stretch. They're going to have to keep the Nebraska defense honest and know that, they can stretch the field through the pass game. How much do you think Ethancik Manis, is he still need to be mostly a game manager? Do you think that this is a game? I mean, looking at the schedule, right? I mean, this is probably between USC and this game, probably their 2 toughest games on the schedule on paper. I feel like at some point, Ethancik Manis is going to have a big game for Rutgers to be able to win in tough conditions.
I mean, we saw him do it against Virginia Tech, I know that there were some lowlights in that. Obviously, the back-to-back sacks. I don't know that he necessarily has to, throw a bunch of bombs to that. Their defense is not like that type of defense. What I think he's going to need to do, though, is he's going to need to complete some third downs that put doubt in the minds of the defense. So if it's 3rd and 10, he's going to have to get maybe one of those completions, maybe in the seam in an area that Nebraska thought they had covered up, for example. But I think that is more of what they need. The other thing is that in the Nebraska defensive backs, kind of like I talked about in their defensive front, they're also not as big as they are traditionally. Traditionally, Nebraska's got those big, heavy-hitting defensive backs that you might be able to beat with a little bit of speed. But now some of them struggle to tackle because they're just small. Sair Wright, who's a cornerback, who people might actually know because he played LeBron James' son in Space Jam 2. He's been playing on one corner and has been playing real well the last couple of weeks, but he's still inexperienced. He's a transfer from USC, as you would expect. He's good in coverage generally, but at times he can be caught out of position in his zone. And so you have an opportunity there. And then their other cornerback is Buford, who's normally a safety, but he has to play cornerback because Tommy Hill, who had a good season, I think last year, is hurt. He's battling, I think, a Liz Frank injury, which Sam Brown can understand. So he's kind of week to week, but they're not cornerbacks who are like known for their coverage. So to try to offset that, that's why some of the times they're playing this quarter scheme. But if they go with their other cornerbacks and safeties, a lot of those guys are a little bit undersized. And so you might be able to take advantage of an Ian Strong, even a KJ Duff, or if you can get Fletcher in a right matchup where they can use their physical skills to make those plays. I have more confidence than a typical offensive coordinator that Kirk Soraka is going to identify these matchups and be able to get the ball out there. Now, we haven't seen Fletcher make a lot of catches over the middle yet. I think he caught one in the seam in the first game against Howard. That was a key third down conversion, kind of like on a almost like a curl route in the seam. But for the most part, they get him going laterally has been proven effective. But you might be able to find a matchup with him. And again, I think this is another Ian Strong prove it game, and he's done it the last 2 weeks. But if he's matched up with a smaller DB, he's got to make the catch. He's got to make those contested catches because that's going to force their linebackers to have to cheat back or even their safeties to have to cheap up. And then I think maybe this is the game where we get one long middle of the field bomb. Because if they're in that Tampa 2 and you can keep the middle linebacker in, the safeties are kind of flowing outside or even corners dropping back. This might be a Chris Long down the middle bomb like we saw, I guess it was 2 years ago now. This might be his opportunity for one of those type of plays where he's just running pretty free down the middle. And we know Ethancik Manis throws better deep over the middle than he does outside the numbers. So that's kind of the home run dream that you have. And then it will cause them to have to back up a little bit more and concede even more running yardage underneath because the Nebraska defense will let you run for 3-4 yards. They'll let you throw for a couple yards and then try to tackle you. So that's where I think Rutgers has to get those yards. It has to be 5 yards if there's space, not 2. It has to be 7 yards, not 4 if it's a bubble screen and they only have 2 guys covering it. So I know that was a lot there, but I don't necessarily think Ethancik Manis needs to put up huge numbers. I don't think he necessarily needs to complete 3 passes over 25 yards. I think he just needs to be effective enough to basically force the defense to have to respect every inch of the field.
That's a great point. And he's right around 70% in terms of his accuracy with short and intermediate passes so far. Rutgers number 17th nationally at third down conversions at 51%. Obviously, converting on third down is going to be huge in this game. The way the defense has prevented teams from scoring in the red zone, just 4 touchdowns on 11 trips. Nebraska commits a ton of penalties, 8 per game, over 70 yards. Rutgers number 5 nationally and fewest penalty yards at 32. So I do think, they have to avoid a bad start, right? They have to avoid big plays. But if this game is close down the stretch, I really do think it does favor Rutgers. First of all, Nebraska is a program that has really struggled to win close games, even since Rule has been there now in his second year. But also the fact that things that have been Rutgers' strengths have been Nebraska's weaknesses, just in terms of committing a lot of mistakes with penalties. Rutgers being able to take advantage of those with their opponents, limiting their own mistakes. Time of possession, of course, will be important. But I do think that the longer this game stays close, it's an advantage to Rutgers. Nebraska will feel more pressure. What we haven't seen is them have to come back. So keeping that score close early on is key. But I guess just in terms of some closing thoughts or final thoughts on this matchup and kind of how you see how Rutgers, the path to victory for Rutgers in this game.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can look at Nebraska's record in one-score games. It's awful under two coaching regimes. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. We talked about special teams being a problem, right? They've been rotating long snappers, kickers. Their punter only had 3 punts last week. He dropped 2 inside the 20, but he's under constant duress. Their gunners on punt coverage have been bad, but I would think that Rutgers, this might be a game where you get a little tricky with that, with punt block, making it not necessarily look like you're trying to block it, because if they keep all their max guys in there, Rutgers doesn't even try to return, so you're just giving up gunners that could be – Rutgers doesn't try to return, right? So basically what you want to do is have less guys in there to block. So if you telegraph a block, then it might not be as effective. When you build a program, there's really 2 ways you can go. And obviously, everyone always they want the best of everything, right? You want the best, biggest, strongest, fastest, best skilled players. Well, if you could get them, your team wouldn't stink, and you wouldn't need a new coach usually. So there's 2 approaches to building a program. One, you start with the basics, and you try to build that steady foundation of special teams, everyone committed to blocking, everyone committed to tackling, which is basically the Schiano approach, right? That's basically what he did. Now, that technique sometimes can stall out because if you eventually don't win enough games, it fails. Luckily, Rutgers is on a good trajectory. The other way is what Matt Rule has tried to do, and he had success with doing at Temple and Baylor, which is you don't focus on things like special teams. You don't focus on wide receiver blocking. You don't focus on making sure everyone rallies to the ball defensively. You're more trying to go for the big splash, because that generates more excitement. It allows you to maybe come back in games. It allows you to generate, maybe it helps you in recruiting probably more than the other foundational approach. And so that's where Nebraska has a much better chance of blowing Rutgers out than the reverse. But like you said, in a close game, that's where those foundational things come into play. And we saw it last week against Washington. Virginia Tech was a little bit different because I think their coaching staff is trying to build it right. But Rutgers being stronger on special teams, Rutgers, the wide receivers being committed to block on every play. There's plenty of plays where Nebraska receivers aren't blocking anybody, not doing anything. Rutgers wide receivers are never doing nothing. And defensively, Nebraska has improved at rallying to the ball, but it's not what they necessarily do best. And even just the commitment to wanting to tackle, I think I mentioned this about Washington. There's plenty of times they didn't want to tackle. They just didn't want to. And they were reluctantly making tackles in a way. And again, you see this at the NFL level. Take a Deion Sanders, a Sauce Gardner. They don't want to tackle, right? But Rutgers, every defender wants to tackle. Now that allows you to get more dinged up, but it also shows this commitment and dedication and brotherhood that I'm not sure that Nebraska is going to win if it's just like you said, just a blow after blow after blow on both sides. Nebraska wants to win this game by 2 touchdowns and take it easy at the end, right? That's what their style of play is, and that's what the way they're going to win a lot of games. Whereas if they get in a slugfest like they did with Illinois, they blinked first, and they ultimately lost that game. And so there was one other point that I wanted to make about that. But in general, yes, I do think that the close game will favor Rutgers, especially if they can get a lot of those body blows in, and that on a day that's hot, especially at the beginning of the game, then that might be a big factor.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. We've talked about it a few times, but just in terms of those intangibles, in terms of the culture, in terms of the belief for this team, in terms of doing the little things, that can be the difference, in winning or losing, and can overcome mistakes that they did make, especially in that Virginia Tech game. They were able, all 3 units rose to the occasion when it mattered most, and they have now 2 close wins under their belt. where Nebraska, their one close game, they lost. So
Right.
I think that mentally is a big part of it too. And I think Rutgers, in a way, has nothing to lose in this game. You know, they're
Exactly.
underdogs. And I think the longer they keep it close, the more pressure Nebraska will feel. Also, just having that history of not being able to close games. I think we've talked about in the past, like crowd intensity. You know, you'll start to hear some groans in the crowd if it's in the fourth quarter and Nebraska makes a key penalty and it's really
Right.
close. It's like, here we go again. And that energy is real and that can impact things. So, I'm optimistic about this game. We don't have to give scores or predictions or anything, but listen, if Nebraska wins 31-14, it wouldn't shock me, right? If they get some big plays early, Rutgers has a turnover early that costs them. We haven't seen if they have the ability to come back yet or not, but I also think there's a very clear path to victory here for Rutgers, almost in a way that is easier to see than against Washington. I'm pretty confident that, you know, if they can continue to play, I know people aren't blown away with how well they played yet, and we've talked about the value in winning, not playing your best. But if they can play in the same kind of framework in terms of, you know, not making critical mistakes, continuing to just offensively have the balance they've had, the defense, being really stout in the red zone, it's going to make it harder in Nebraska. And I think they have a real shot to come out the winners in this game.
Yeah, I mean, I preseason predicted a win for all the reasons that you're saying. True freshman quarterback, Rutgers more buttoned up overall. I think Nebraska has played better than anyone expected. What's kind of odd about this is that even Matt Rule is playing some psychological games with the media over there, which I find kind of interesting. Like, he always says we're a good team, and then if he's talking about somebody, he uses the word really quite often. So he'll say his kicker, who has struggled, he has a really, 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 really strong leg. I think he said 7 reallys in the sentence. And so it's kind of, he's trying to almost convince them that they're disrespected as a team and that people don't think they're very good. And I don't know if that's because they're being very harsh behind closed doors, but then he's trying to the media. I mean, we have no way of really knowing. Even the Nebraska media is not really sure why this is happening. But it does feel like for some reason he has to publicly give his team more confidence in the media than seems like they need to do. It just seems kind of odd. And so, I mean, Nebraska's media is tough. Like, it's basically the New York level of media for college sports in terms of, like, their whole state has one team, and that's a college level historic program, and so I find it kind of weird. There's some weird stuff that he said about injuries. It's kind of odd. So I do think that false confidence can work until you're in a true, like, gut punching situation. And then, I mean, I think the point you're making about Rutgers is that this team actually has not reached their ceiling whatsoever, but they have maintained a floor high enough that avoiding, like, critical penalties, critical turnovers, a lot of huge big plays outside of 1 or 2 against Virginia Tech to give themselves a chance to win. And when you're playing a lot of these games, like, the reason I don't expect Rutgers to go, let's say 12-0 or even 10-2 is because a lot of these toss-ups, one break either way. I mean, if Washington hits that field goal last week and we're in overtime, they have all the momentum. They got all the firepower. I mean, that could go awry. Same thing with Virginia Tech if that game goes to overtime. And so a guy stumbles, a bad snap, anything can happen, like in the Michigan State game last year, and things can spiral out of control. So Rutgers has maintained, like, a high floor to kind of stay in a lot of these games, but ultimately, no, unless they kind of play their best game. If Nebraska plays well, Nebraska should win. If Nebraska plays well, Rutgers has to play their best game to win. If both teams play I think Rutgers' floor is higher than Nebraska's. If one team plays well and the other team plays bad, obviously they're going to win. But, this where, again, to your point, Rutgers has a clearer path to victory in this game than they did even against Washington last week. And so let's see if they can take advantage of it in a game that, again, Rutgers loses this game on the road. You got 2 winnable games the next 2 weeks, 6-1 if you take care of business there. This is a nice to have, but even if they lose this game, they're not eliminated from anything. They're not eliminated from a New Year's Day bowl or anything like that with the remaining schedule. So, I mean, really, we want them to play well.
You want to see a step forward from this team, and like you said, I mean, it's a game of inches, and that's why they're in so many toss-up games. They're projected to be in 9 one-score games going into the season, and the odds of you winning all 9 of those, is very, 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 very hard to play off Matt Rule. Very, 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 very hard. And but in terms of but I think when you play a team that is mistake prone and struggles to win close games, they do have a clear edge in that regard. So can they get to the fourth quarter and the pressure is on? I would feel really good about Rutgers' chances in that regard. And I think, just in terms of Monungai and Brown, I mean, that's the obvious advantage I think they have in that run game, that 1-2 punch, where if they can deliver the body blows and they can control time of possession down the stretch, I think they're going to win. So we'll see what happens. Any last thoughts?
Just again, I mean, I think this is a game where you've never beaten Nebraska. They could go on to have a very nice season themselves. And the question of a whole signature win last week, we're kind of If you go in there and you play really well and you beat them up, it could be a signature win.
Yeah.
Right? It could be. Especially if Nebraska goes on, in hindsight, to have a nice season. That being said, again, you're not going in the game to lose, right? But you're going into the game knowing that you got to win 2 of the next 3 games to get bowl eligible heading into your bye. You win this one, then you only got to win 1 more. A lot less pressure on Rutgers if you can do that. And again, you continue the quest for a truly magical season.
Well said, as always, David Anderson. Thanks so much for being back twice this week. And check out all of our coverage. We broke down the Virginia Tech game earlier this week. I had just covers Nebraska on to really detail the Huskers earlier this week as well. And then now this game preview, and Rutgers kicking off 4 p.m. Eastern at Nebraska on Saturday, FS1. And plenty of post-game coverage following this game. Obviously, a huge opportunity for both teams as Rutgers looks to go 2-0 and 5-0 overall. Thanks so much for listening and watching once again here at the Scarlet Faithful podcast.